In Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at biochemistry. Biochemistry is going to look at the elements and compounds that make the body function. In the first section, we're going to look at what are called carbon compounds. So compounds that are based on carbon, and there are a lot that are probably familiar that you don't typically think about. So here we have graphite, a diamond, coal, and then natural gases that you might burn in your home for either heating or cooking. So first we need to look at carbon bonding, and why is carbon so important? So organic compounds are compounds that are composed of carbon, and they make up almost all living things and things that were once living, like fossil fuels. If we look at this picture, you've got carbon, and then hydrogens are bonded to it, and those are called hydrocarbons. They're very simple structures. Inorganic compounds are going to be compounds that, for the most part, don't contain carbon. They might contain carbon, but it's not going to be something that is a basis for life. So one question to look at, can a compound be organic and still have carbon? And can you think of any examples? So if you think of something that's a compound with carbon, but it's not something that's alive. So probably one very familiar example would be carbon dioxide. We breathe out carbon dioxide. It has carbon as a component, but it's not something that's alive. So if we look at carbon, it has special properties because when we look at the structure of carbon, we have different layers that contain electrons. So the electrons that are in the outermost layer are the electrons that can bond with other elements and make more complex compounds. So any place here where you have just one by itself is a spot where another element can bond to that with their electron. So on carbon, we have one available spot, 2, 3, 4 spots where different elements can combine. And that's pretty exceptional. Some elements can only combine with 1, 2, or maybe 3, but to be able to combine in 4 different locations makes it very flexible and very able to form different shapes and structures. So if we look at this, it says draw or type an X to indicate where atoms can bond. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4 different spots. So these are just a couple of examples of how carbon would do that. In carbon dioxide, we're bonding with 2 different elements or 2 different atoms, oxygen on each side. So they didn't fill up all 4 spots, just 2. Methane is going to have 4 different atoms bond to that carbon. And then glucose is going to combine with different carbons and make bigger structures. Here are more examples of how carbon bonds. And so if we think of those 4 different spots around carbon, and this is why it's thought of as kind of exceptional, because it can bond so many different ways. So 4 hydrogens around that carbon make methane. And then in our 4 spots here, in one spot we've bonded to another carbon. And so we've got starting to make a chain. And you can see adding an additional carbon on is going to allow us to make bigger and bigger chains of carbons. And so all of these are probably familiar: ethane, propane, butane, different fuels that you can burn in different forms. One structure that's kind of special, at one point they knew there was a structure with 60 carbons, but they couldn't really figure out the shape. And one man named Buckminster Fuller was able to discover this shape, and it's called the Buckminster fullerene. And so if you look at it, it looks like a soccer ball. Some people think it looks like the Spaceship Earth ride in Epcot, the main ball there. But one cool thing about Buckminster Fuller, this is him, and he actually was a professor at SIU Carbondale, and his home that he built like his Buckminster Fullerene shape is actually still located in Carbondale, and it's something that you can drive by and see. The next thing we need to look at is what's called a functional group. So this is a group of atoms that you can put on possibly one of those carbon spots that changes the characteristics of that compound that's formed. So here are some different functional groups, and all of these would be things that could attach to one of those carbon available spots to bond, and they're going to give different characteristics. For example, if you've heard of formaldehyde, which is what's called an aldehyde, that means this group is combined on a structure. Alcohols, different forms of alcohols, are going to have an oxygen and a hydrogen attached. And so you can see there are several different types of functional groups. Next, looking at large carbon molecules. So a simple unit, the simplest structure of that carbon is called a monomer. And when we think of these big chains, we often think of these as like a bead in maybe a necklace. So one bead would be considered a monomer. If we put several of those beads or several of those units together, they're called polymers. And so you can see here, monomers are going to connect to make polymers. Many polymers put together are called macromolecules, and some of these are carbohydrates. When you think of eating carbs, those are actually macromolecules. Lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are all long chains of simple repeating patterns over and over of compounds. The next thing we're going to look at are what are called condensation reactions. So when we attach those pieces or those monomers together to make a polymer, it requires a chemical reaction to make them stick together, basically. And so each time that reaction takes place, a water molecule is going to be released or given off. So if we look at this, we can see we've got a unit that's a monomer. We're trying to attach to another monomer. On one end of our monomer, we've got an O and an H. And on the other end, we have an H. So if we are linking those together, just like we would beads, the O and the H and then the single H are going to combine together to make H2O and produce water. So then the monomers can stick together and then the water will be produced. So in our chain, we won't see those OH and H's. We just see the monomers stuck together. Hydrolysis is the opposite. So if we're trying to take apart those polymers and make individual monomers, we have to put the water back in. So we're going to put the OH on one end and the H on the other to break those apart. Then we're going to look at what's called energy currency. And so what fuels our body? And a lot of times we think simply, oh, it's the food that provides our energy. But if we look at that on a molecular level, it's actually a form of energy which is called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So we can see the A comes from the adenosine and the T is from the tri, just like the number 3 is triphosphate. So that's our ATP. And this is going to be something we'll talk about over and over again throughout the year is ATP. So if we look at the structure of ATP, when you see this ring-like shape, those elements are actually combined in a structure like that. So ATP is made up of a ribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar. And so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points on this pink molecule, and those are all where carbons are attached. Then the adenine is a nitrogen type compound, and you can see the N's there representing the nitrogen. And then we have 3, that tri, 3 phosphate groups that are attached. So the P is our phosphate. So there's 1, 2, 3. And so that would make the structure ATP. When we're looking at how is energy produced, when a phosphate breaks off, energy is going to give off. So the ATP, or 3 phosphates, breaks off one of those phosphates, gives off energy, and creates what's called ADP, or di, or 2 phosphates. So remember, the main energy molecule in our body is what's called ATP.